Good afternoon. It's Monday, the 6th of March 2017, just after 1 o'clock. Welcome to UK Column News. I'm your host, Brian Gerrish. With me in the studio, Mike Robinson. Delighted to say we'll be joined by live video Skype link by Dr. Graham Downing and also by David Ellis from Strategic Defence Initiatives. And altogether a pretty heavy and special news, I think, including some comment on the court of social media, which apparently convened over the weekend, but more on that in a minute.
Right, so we're going to get straight in with this, because on Friday we were mentioning this GQ article, Buried Alive, Stories from Inside Solitary Confinement, and we were reminding everybody that, of course, that Melanie Shaw has been in solitary confinement in a British prison for an extended period of time. She was out of solitary confinement for a couple of weeks, but apparently straight back in again as soon as, as soon as the authorities thought that nobody was looking. So we wanted to invite Graham Downing on the programme to discuss the effects of solitary confinement on people. So welcome to the programme, Graham. Where do you want to start with this?
Anywhere you want to start, really.
Well, the first article that, of course, also timely was from the Independent. UK prisons holding child inmates in solitary confinement against UN torture rules. We're going to discuss the effect on the brain of this, but that effect must be accentuated when you're young.
Yeah, I'm not an expert on prisons. I do know a bit about the brain, thank God. And part of the talk that I'm going to be doing, quite a major part, AV8, is going to be discussing the brain and how it's changing due to all the changes in the environment and the medicines and the social media. So we're going to do all that kind of stuff. And this kind of dovetails in. This is an extreme example of it, because obviously putting someone in four walls and locking them up all day long, some 24 hours a day, others 23 hours a day, depriving them of human contact and taking the control away from them, there's major issues with the body, both physical damage and mental damage. And if you look at the experts in this field, the neuroscientists, the psychologists, the psychiatrists, I think, the very least you can say, there's a significant body of work now that demonstrates neurophysiological changes and actually permanent changes. And to come back to your question, the younger you stress an individual, the younger, and lots of work looking at child abuse and looking at stress of children at a very young age. If you incarcerate someone, if you put someone into solitary at a very young age, then you are massively risking the health of that child. And what you are risking is not just damage, but irreversible damage to their brain.
Okay, well, you wanted to highlight this document here from the European Commission, European Prison Observatory, from national practices, European guidelines, interesting initiatives in prisons management. And the first quote here is, thus, the Council of Europe recommends in particular to use solitary confinement as a disciplinary punishment only in exceptional circumstances and for short periods of time, no longer than 14 days and preferably lower. So that is what the European Commission is saying. And also in this document, they make the point that concerning solitary confinement as a disciplinary punishment, in Scotland and Northern Ireland, this sanction is prohibited, and prison rules state that segregation is not to be used as a punishment. So, this is an incredible situation where we have, devolved regimes, shall we call them, who are at least taking a stand on this issue. But the European Commission's advice is no longer than 14 days. And yet in England and Wales, we seem to have people in solitary, including children, in solitary confinement for extended periods and in some cases months or years.
Well, 11 months for Melanie Shaw.
What are your thoughts on this, Graham?
Well, it's not until you look into some of these subjects in particular do you just sort of sit back in aghast, really, and just amazement that this stuff still goes on. I can't see from the literature any justification putting someone in solitary confinement. And now, I'm not an expert in prison, so I can't comment on that. But the literature is really clear that, and in fact, one of the researchers said that this kind of damage that could be done to the brain, and we're talking serious damage. We're talking about initially anxiety, initially not being able to eat properly, not digesting their food properly, basic stuff you get with stress. They're moving all the way through to very serious problems like psychosis and inability to control oneself correctly, and inability to think properly, to the point where people come out and they can't communicate with other people. They can't even do a simple thing like watch TV. And some of these changes, as I said, they happen after, and they remain happening long after they've come out of solitary confinement. Now, I don't see how that can help anyone. If you're changing someone's brain to the point where they can't interact properly with other people, and as we know, they can become far more aggressive, then what's the point of doing it? Because you aren't changing that person to be a good member of the prison community, or if they are allowed out into the public, to be a good member of the public as well. I mean, there's a high degree of recidivism. These people then go back in because they simply can't handle themselves properly and behave correctly once they come outside of these four walls.
In your view, how much of an effect would an extended period in solitary confinement have on someone's recall of past events, for example?
Well, there's many areas that can be affected by stress, because what you're doing is you're putting someone in a highly stressed environment where they have no control. And there's various hormones that are affected by this. One of the major stress hormones is cortisol, that people may have heard of. And I do a lot of work with cortisol with patients, just normal people going to work and they're very stressed, and we work with balancing these hormones. In an environment where you're in solitary confinement or you're away from other human interaction, these hormones can be overproduced constantly. And then what happens is there's areas of the brain, in the temporal region of the brain, to do with something called the limbic system. And you have an area called the hippocampus and another area called the amygdala. And these areas are very, very closely linked to stress and to long-term memory, and also to working out, is something going to harm me or not? And what happens if you put someone in an environment over long periods of time, you damage these areas, and in fact can create irreversible damage in these areas, and you can't process this information correctly anymore. And effects are, as I've stated, you become very aggressive, you can overreact, and also what can happen is your memory can also have issues, because parts, as I just described, parts of this brain are to do with memory. And I would suggest you go from being, excuse me, someone, you can put a very healthy person in there that can have very good recall, very reliable in terms of recalling factual information. If you do this for a prolonged period of time, then you are seriously damaging that person's ability to perform normally and function normally.
Okay, well, now last week we showed the GQ article and had a couple of quotes from it. You pointed me at this website, Prison Watch UK, and we've got some quotes from this website from people that have experienced this. 10 suicide attempts so far, and my mental health is deteriorating, but I'm doing better than a lot of the others. Before CSC, I was on no medications. Now I'm on antidepressants, antipsychotics, and Valium. This is just the pressure of being here. Most CSC prisoners end up in hospitals. That's another prisoner. Another one, segregation just made me worse and made me mentally even more ill. They say it's a tool to challenge, made me more ill, behavior even worse. This is a quote from a manager at a prison. Everyone knows the damaging effects of segregation. I'm surprised the General Medical Council isn't challenging the use of segregation and the high risk it places on individuals. If GMC said no to segregation, then governors would not use it, but doctors sign up to it. Another quote you wanted to highlight from this, from a prisoner. I don't want to harm prison officers, so I've been harming myself to such a degree that I've almost died 2 times. Another prisoner saying, feeling suicidal, neglected, victimized, locked up 23 hours on my bed, covering my head. I was cold, depressed, and suicidal, cried myself to sleep, not mentally able to do anything. Another quote, this time from an officer, a prison officer. A kid, 19, was found almost dead. He hanged himself. He was a prolific attempter of suicide. Left segregation to the house block with no proper handover. By the time staff got to him, he was almost dead. We cut him down. We worked on him until the paramedics came. He was a nice lad. It's not like Baywatch, he said. We don't really actually want to go into too much of that. We had to tell the nurse what to do. He's done it a few times before and got close, but not that close. So, this website just has quote after quote after quote, Graham, from prisoners, from prison officers, from managers, and even one governor. And yet this seems to get so little coverage in the media about the effects of it. And really, we have no idea of the scale of the number of people that are being put in solitary at the moment.
I think when I looked at it, and as I said, I'm not an expert on prisons, but I looked at people who were experts. I looked at the literature. I think up to 10% of the prison population, others say 5%. I think what's really, when you look at those awful quotes there, and what's absolutely clear is the vast majority of self-harm and 50% of the suicides happen from people in solitary confinement. Now, bearing in mind you might only have 5 or 10% in there, that gives you a massive, a huge eye-opener to the increased the increased risk to suicide and self-harm. I mean, they sit in there, and you see it with animals. If you put animals, they do this. They've done terribly. They've done experiments with monkeys, and they've put them in cages where they can't get out, in sort of inverted triangles where they're slipping. They've got no control, and in the end, they just sit in a corner, rocking their head and banging their head against the wall. And similarly, this is what happens with humans, according to the experts in this field, is that you lose control. Your brain undergoes changes. You become mentally unwell. And these are massively significant, these changes. And before, people thought, oh, it's just a psychological issue. And in other words, there's no proper neurophysiological change. But now they're measuring, neuroscientists are measuring actual changes in the brain. And areas of these brains are changing. Areas of the brain which should be a particular size are changing, are becoming smaller, are become overactivated. And you're seeing these changes which literally take a sane human being and make them mentally sick and mentally unwell and physically unwell.
Yes. Can I just interject there, if I may, and say, and presumably, if you have somebody that's already under huge stress or they've suffered post-traumatic stress, as Melanie Shaw has with her abuse, then these effects are presumably going to be greatly magnified.
Yeah, I mean, if obviously I can't comment on an individual case because I don't know all the details, but from the literature, if you look at when you look at the literature for children that have been abused, and as I said, this is awful, it's awful it happens, but awful it happens at that time because you get irreversible changes to the brain. And as I said, keeping it real simple, these two areas of the brain, the amygdala and the hippocampus, become changed in the left hemisphere of the brain. And what you tend to see is things like this, the amygdala will shrink and it becomes very much overexcited. And this is the area that discerns whether something is friend or foe, whether something's going to attack you, or it's just a stick on the floor, but it looks like a snake. Now, most rational people will say, well, that's a stick. If you take an abused child, that part of the brain that's supposed to filter that information out becomes irreversibly damaged. So in other words, they're in a heightened state where they can be made to be fearful and they can be made to have anxiety and all sorts of horrible things and psychosis and hallucinations. If you then put them into a further stressful example, then that is absolutely, I mean, it's just beyond comprehension that you would ever do that to a human being.
Right, Graham, you also highlighted this website, Solitary Watch. Now, unfortunately, I can't remember the name of the doctor that gave this quote. The physical lack of activity, the lack of interaction with the natural world, the lack of interaction with other human beings, the lack of visual stimulation, the lack of touch. Each one of these has been studied not only in humans, but in animal models, and each one is by itself sufficient to change the brain and change it dramatically, depending on whether it lasts briefly or extended. And by extended, I mean days, not decades. So that scientist, that doctor, not even talking weeks or months, but days. And also on the Solitary Watch website, we've got more quotes. Solitary confinement units are virtual incubators of psychosis, seeding illness. Just quotes after quote. Nobody can deny the effects of this. So it is absolutely incredible that we continue to support it. And you sent me that image from the Solitary Watch website from somebody who spent 9 years in solitary confinement, and that pretty much sums it up, I think.
Oh, it's just awful. And you know, I think that might have been Alec who did that scientist or who did that work. They all appear to agree with each other, and you know there doesn't seem to be much doubt on this. And this is why I find it incredulous that we'll still have this practice. And hats off to Scotland and Northern Ireland, or Ireland if they're not putting people in solitary confinement. But what's changed now is it's not just it's someone's word. Well, I don't feel well, and there's a behavioural issue. What's changed now is there's hardcore science that has looked at the brain, and the brain is actually changing, and the areas of the brain are changing, are the areas where we're most human, the areas where we can interact with other people and we have a sense of self. Because what one of the scientists quoted there said, people lose their sense of self. So in other words, you just literally lose your mind. You don't know who you are. You lack cognition. You lack the ability to have good free thought processes. And then what happens if that's done for a prolonged period of time, you start to then go into psychosis, you hallucinate, and you have illusions. And that can't be good for anyone, regardless if they've committed a crime or not. That is just horrendous behaviour.
Well, indeed. And somebody in the chat box asking, is Melanie being given any stimulating material? And of course,
for a lot of the time she wasn't, Mike. She was not being given reading material. So we know that she's been sort of hammered by both the solitary confinement and not actually having anything to stimulate her at all.
And of course, we don't actually know what the situation is today.
No, we don't. But it was clearly pretty brutal before, because she was talking about 23 and a half hours locked up, occasionally given the opportunity to shower, but no interaction at all during the day with other prisoners. And this is a woman who, of course, has suffered years of abuse and other mental torture as a result of the child abuse that she suffered. So I've got to put in here, because we need to mention it, this is the state not of some so-called third world country. This is Britain today under Theresa May, Prime Minister, Amber Rudd, Home Secretary. So the sheer hypocrisy when we see British politicians on the world stage pointing a finger at Africa or perhaps Eastern Europe, we've got the very same torture going on in this country.
Yes, Graham, we'll leave it at that point, but thank you very much for that. You got any final comments?
I think it's just, I mean, I think there's little doubt now that it's inhumane to do this. And even in some, and then I saw a quote from the teenage prisoners. They were lucky. Some of them, they had a shower 3 times a week. I mean, it's just disgraceful. And I think in England, as you said, we deserve better, and I think prisoners deserve better as well.
Okay, thank you very much, Graham. Brian.
Right, well, we've started off the news with a pretty dark subject. This is not theory, this is the reality of the sorts of things that are going on in UK. And of course, the other immense cover-up we've got is of child abuse itself. So we know this is going on at scale in UK. We know that the British government is involved. We know that our Prime Minister, Theresa May, is helping to protect abusers by, for example, keeping whistleblowers such as Melanie Shaw in prison. And this is a subject which takes a huge effort by all of us to get the material out in front of the public, and of course to encourage other child abuse victims and survivors to come forward with their tale. So this is quite a tough job. And well, over the weekend, the Court of Social Media was convened, and I was starring apparently in that court. So let's have a look at what was going on. We just remind our audience that Friday we followed the lead of mainstream media by reporting on this gentleman, former commander in the Royal Navy called Charles Howeson, who was charged and is due to appear in court on the 13th of April. So remember that a court case is in progress. That's a pretty significant thing to say. But we did give a little bit more information by pointing out that it was somewhat ironic that Devon and Cornwall Police had set up an important investigation panel where they were going to use upstanding members of the community to work alongside the police as they investigated crime. Perhaps that crime could be child abuse, for example. And top of the list, we see on this document from Devon and Cornwall Police website, Mr. Howeson was listed as top of the people the police would choose to assist them. And we pointed out that this raises immense questions over separation of powers with the police and the fact that the police should be totally independent to investigate crimes. But increasingly we see that they're not. Witness, for example, the police being included in child protection panels, so that if any of those panel members commit a child abuse crime, the police are automatically implemented. Some other names on that, but let's just move on. Well, I tweeted this out this morning, the weekend child abuse, the weekend Court of Social Media convened. join Brian Gerrish today as I stand up to be counted. And I totally mean this, because it's time really to call the shots as they are, because I think some people simply do not understand how difficult and sometimes dangerous the world of child abuse and exposure is. Well, this was one little tweet or post that we picked up over the weekend. It's from Talk Girl 8, and it said, Brian also forgot to mention that he and Charles Howeson were co-directors of Bailey Energy Management Limited. And I will answer to that I don't think I forgot, but timing is everything. However, everything has now changed because somebody has decided to go public, so it's only appropriate that I should comment. So let's follow it through. Well, here we are, a nice sounding website, Goodness and Harmony, wordpress.com. And over the weekend, they started to post a great deal of information about former Commander Charles Howeson and all of his connections. And I will point out that this is a website that overwhelmingly the research is dedicated to exposing child abuse and abusers. And most of the research would appear to be good quality, but there is a vast amount of it. And it was very interesting to see what was actually appearing on that. The first point I'm going to make, though, is that the website is anonymous. I sit in front of a camera with Mike Robinson. We say what we have to say. We're open. We can be seen. We put our heads above the parapet. And I am becoming increasingly irritated by people who post but want to remain anonymous. I think if you have something to say, you should stand up to be counted. So we don't know who the person is that runs the website, but they know who I am. They can simply pick up the phone or email me, and I'm very happy to answer any questions. Now, this person has also clearly never watched any of my talks about common purpose, because in that I specifically mentioned that Plymouth Chamber of Commerce was one of the first organisations to try and silence me when I began to report fraud and corruption in Plymouth. And I add here that at the time I was giving those talks, there was no reason for me to talk about the Bailey companies because they were not significant, and indeed they're still not. So what can we find out about the anonymous website? Well, absolutely nothing. There is no contact details, there's no person, there's no means of speaking to anybody easily. And maybe the intent behind this website is good, but I find people that are doing this sort of work, I find it's cowardly if they do not want to stand up and be counted. So what did they have to say about me? Well, they flagged up that I was involved with the Plymouth Chamber of Commerce and Industry. That's an open secret. They also talked about companies I'd been involved with some years ago, which included Charles Howeson, which indeed they did. So let's have a look at this here. This is a list of members, some of the members of Plymouth Chamber of Commerce at the time that Charles Howeson was chairman. I am listed top, but many other names are simply omitted. So I'm going to say that I was clearly made top of this list to emphasise me. And then when we come down here where we're looking at the companies, I believe that this is a deliberate attempt to smear me and indeed the others, because there's only partial research on these companies and how they really operated. So the claim the website's making is effectively that I was sitting next to Mr. Howeson during my daily work, when that was not how these companies operated. And we'll bring this in. Amongst the really detailed research on the Goodness and Harmony website, it seems to miss a key fact that I served on board a warship, HMS Cleopatra, with Mr. Howeson. So it goes on. We have another page here, and this is how information is linked together. So the top one is talking about Mr. Howeson's connection with the UK Sea Fish Authority, and underneath it's showing me I think at the start of the period that I was captain of a fishery protection vessel, HMS Orkney.
Yes, that article came out just as you were taking command, and was introducing you to, I mean, it was a Royal Naval publication, if I remember rightly.
Yes. So I'll just point this bit out here. That word says link. So the inference being put forward is that almost that Charles Howeson was running the fishery operation that I was taking part in, which is complete and utter nonsense. So we're now going into very sloppy research. That's a possibility, or else this is deliberately designed to smear. And what I find unpleasant with this particular article is that since the other two gentlemen don't have their images blanked out, is the attempt to smear them as well. So if we summarise this a bit, we're going to say, first of all, we don't know who Goodness and Harmony is, but where were they when I was at work over some 20 years exposing common purpose, state fraud, corruption and child abuse? So these are some of the points. I exposed massive fraud and corruption in Plymouth connected to regeneration, public and EU funding. Sorry, that should be funding. I exposed common purpose, firstly in Plymouth, but that then later spread to across UK. And together with others, I received threats. I personally received death threats. My family were threatened and intimidated. I had used hypodermic needles put in my hanging flower baskets. I had late night phone calls and knocks on my door. There was an arson attempt on a colleague, but in fact they got the wrong house. My children were tracked. Rumours were spread that I was mentally ill. I was warned to back off my research or my company would lose contracts. And specifically, I was told to resign from the Chamber of Commerce or be sacked in disgrace. The inference was that there would be a significant slur on my character. I don't know where Goodness and Harmony was at that time. We've then worked with the UK column for years to help expose CP fraud, child abuse and the plight of others persecuted by the British state. We've published reports of the Howeson case, and where are we now? Well, there is a court case in progress, and I will say I had a decision to make, and I made a particular decision. There is a court case in progress. So I'm visible. I have a telephone number and an email address, and I would like to say to Goodness and Harmony, please put your cards on the table and call me. There's my mobile number, or you can email me. And let's see what you've really got. Either put up factual evidence which is appearing to implicate me, that will be very interesting, or perhaps you've jumped to some conclusions, but make yourself visible.
But the key point here, Brian, is that it was the fraud, the corruption, the other criminality within the establishment of Plymouth which resulted in the creation of the UK column in the first place.
Indeed.
And if you hadn't been involved with some of the people at the very top of the Plymouth establishment,
I would never have known what was going on in the first place.
Right.
So we've got a very interesting situation here. At the moment, I am giving this website the benefit of the doubt, but unless somebody comes forward to contact me so that we know that there's a real person behind this website, I have to draw the conclusion that this website is deliberately trying to undermine the work that we are doing, particularly in the field of child abuse. So let's have a look at what sort of response Goodness and Harmony has generated. So we picked this up at the weekend, and we've got a comment that was posted on our YouTube, and it says, well, we've mentioned it briefly. Brian also forgot to mention Charles Howeson, the co-directors of Bailey Energy Management. The person was Talk Girl 8, and where did that lead me? Well, it led me to Hoaxstead Research. So here we've got the spoilers. The people are trying to say that the two young children in Hampstead were not abused. It was all a hoax. This is one of the most vile websites I think you can go to. A lot of it is obscene. It's anti-everything. It's very, very unpleasant. And who did we find? Well, there she is. There's Talk Girl 8. So I don't know what goodness and harmony is. Is this a deliberate attack to try and undermine the UK column? Please continue to dig harmony, because it's going to be interesting to see what you don't find. But on the other hand, if you've just been a bit slack, I'm going to say have the guts to stand up and be counted, and contact me and let's have a discussion about what's what.
Okay, let's bring David Ellis in at this point. Chatham House was busy this morning tweeting stuff out. On security and defence, uncertainty seems to be the name of the game, they said. And in a second tweet, a breakdown in security cooperation would be catastrophic. We need to remove uncertainty around institutions such as NATO. Well, that uncertainty seems to be being removed today, because here's Michael Fallon at his doorstep press briefing as he arrived for the EU Foreign Affairs Ministers meeting this morning. This is taking place in Brussels. They're having a joint session of defence and foreign ministers on the implementation of the EU global strategy in the area of security and defence. And what I'm going to say here is that everything that the UK column and that David Ellis have been highlighting for the last year or two is now out in the open. So let's begin by just showing a little video clip here that the EU has pushed out. Here we go. The EU wants to reinforce its security and defence capability. It wants to respond to external conflicts and crises in Europe's neighbourhood. It's going to protect civilians. It's going to do all this wonderful stuff. But at the heart of it is EU defence integration, military integration. And so this little promotional video was released to go with this meeting of the Foreign Affairs and Defence Ministers. And so it goes on. We're going to fight terrorism and we're going to combat human smugglers and traffickers, counter arms trafficking. It's fantastic. And there's Ms. Mogherini, the EU's foreign minister. We're going to discuss how to make Europe safer by doing more, better, and together. Just to show that it is the Council of the European Union that has produced this little promo. But the Express takes the biscuit today because they produced this headline: "Back off, Fallon blasts EU army plot as Britain set to oppose creation of Brussels force." And the first thing that struck me about this headline was that the back off was in capitals, but it was only in single quotes, Brian. So it's not in double quotes. Underneath the headline, they put a little video clip, which is Fallon's doorstep briefing, and they say Defence Secretary Michael Fallon today blasted the EU's plot to create its own army and urged it to back off. He did nothing of the sort. They said the cabinet heavyweight described the Euro force as unnecessary as he arrived in Brussels for the crunch talks. Well, I'm going to show you what he said in a second, but this is a total lie from the Express. Fallon said that he wanted to avoid unnecessary duplication of certain things. You'll hear it for yourself in a second. He didn't say that an EU integrated military force was unnecessary. He didn't say that he was ordering them to back off. And so the Express goes on to say he strongly implied that Britain is set to oppose the creation of such an army, which is backed by some member states, including Germany. Another total lie from the Express. He didn't even gently imply that Britain would oppose such an army. He made the remarks, the Express says, as he jetted into the Belgian capital for the meeting of the EU Foreign Affairs Committee meeting. So I'm going to say that this headline, this article from the Express, is absolute fake news. And just before we bring David in, let's just have a quick look at what Michael Fallon actually said.
Well, good morning. Although we're leaving the European Union, we continue to cooperate with our European partners on defence and security and in the fight against terrorism and aggression. This month we are deploying troops to Estonia, later to Poland, and we are sending RAF jets to Romania. We also continue to play our part in the European mission in the Mediterranean, rescuing migrants and tackling people smuggling. Today, we are urging the European Union to cooperate more closely with NATO to avoid unnecessary duplication and structures, and to work together on new threats, including the need to strengthen cyber security. Thank you.
So, David, to avoid unnecessary duplication and structures, that's far from saying that any kind of integrated EU military is unnecessary, and he certainly didn't tell anyone to back off anything.
That's quite correct. It's all in the wording here, and words count, as General Peter Zwack has said so many times. This is a main gate decision happening here, and this is a main gate decision for the unification of all of the militaries in an all-in basis across the EU zone. So that includes nukes, the lock, stock, and Her Majesty's barrels, everything. So for Fallon to say, when he uses the word continued cooperation with our EU partners, that means EU military unification. There you go. That's clear. He's just using very, very soft language so nobody gets spooked or alerted to it. So we've got to bear a couple of things in mind. Fallon is pro-EU, and key to the EU is achieving this objective. It's vital for them in order to continue with the currency at all. So it's more or less going to underwrite the currency and all the currency issued. So Germany requires this, and the EU requires this. It's as simple as that. And we've got, unfortunately, a bridgehead that Cameron has took us into called the Franco-British Council Lancaster House Agreement, which Brian has written so well about, and you guys there at the UKC alerting everyone sort of 5 years ago. So when he says avoid duplication, that means we're going for military unification because he wants to avoid having double or treble sort of operating systems. So that means we're going for unification because he doesn't want things overlapping. So that means less single point, which is the EU's objective. So this thing is absolutely necessary for the EU, and it isn't being blocked by our British government. The British government are supporting it via being the biggest investor in the EU Investment Bank, which feeds and funds the EU Defence Agency. So we're seeing a load of nobbling going on by Alan Duncan with letters that should be going to committees to alert to this because they're saying that it's politically important, and that's not happening. So the committees can't do their judgment. But what we've got to look at here is this process that's happening today. This is a verbal meeting. The seniors there at the EU, the officials, the unelected tyranny, are asking for agreement, political alignment. The process is owned by the EU. The process is literally asking. And if Fallon says yes, under the instruction of May and the rest of her cabinet, if she says yes in any fashion or yes to some of it or whatever, that's how it will work. That will then start the process and it will come into Parliament, and then they'll all go, what on earth's this? Because none of them have had their radar up. None of them are looking at it. You know, for 2 or 3 years now, we've been sort of challenging this, and it's literally been unbearable in some cases because they've refused to accept that this is happening, because they want to run military from Brussels, and the effect obviously means that we will lose Her Majesty's Armed Services. There'll be no Royal Navy, there'll be no Royal Air Force, no Royal Marines. It will be EU. There'll be an EU army as a result. There won't be a British army. It'll be part of it. So whether we have to literally say no. Why is Fallon there? Okay, if we're leaving, why is he there at all? Because John Redwood has said we should leave the EU to get on with this if they wish it. We shouldn't interfere. We are leaving. They'll agree with that. So why is he there?
Well, because, David, they've told us many, many times that while we're members, we have to be fully engaged.
Oh, yeah, fully engaged. Yeah, we'll be fully engaged, all right, when they agree to military unification and the concept. You know, the concept is all in. You know, this is why there's the real serious problem here with getting any traction with this, because as soon as you say to, you know, well, where's the reports? Where's this? No, hang on a minute. It's not working like that. The EU are not doing it like that. They're going to ask. It's a verbal process. You know, Jacques Delors, we know from Lord Teviot, asked Maggie for it in 1984. It was asked Maggie for it, and she said no. So this is the process. So you know, this is the main gate decision today that's happening here, and the very fact that Fallon's there at all is speaking volumes, and I strongly suspect that there will be some severe dealing done there today, and this is the bit where it's really, really worrying, because the rest of the MPs just don't seem to have accepted that this is going on. Just how vitally important it is for everything in this country. All of the driving mechanisms for engineering and manufacturing and innovation hinge of our defence industry, which has been strangled to death under this policy since World War II. You know, we've cut. We've gone into pan-European manufacture from the 57 Sandies, paper, and we are where we are now under the current leadership. You know, so we've got to kind of be to say that this was a kind of nuclear alert wouldn't be an understatement, because the concept is all in. It's not going to say that they're not going to want to be. And of course, there's a lot of Germans already out there saying already, you know, this isn't all in. You know, all of it goes in, including the bombers and the manufacturing and the subs and what's left at Barrow and Aldermaston, you know, and we've already got joint nuclear stockpiles. We've already got, in effect, joint nuclear production of warheads for the next generation, you know, and of course, we're seeing this shutting down of whistleblowing from officers, because a lot of this stuff from the point when they created when the Royal Navy constructed the EU's military command and control headquarters at Northwood, and there are 100 EU staff in there, and there's one in Paris, and there's one in Potsdam, and there's one in Greece. They can effect EU military union or unification of the military across the whole European Schengen zone in 24 hours, and I've had that confirmed by an admiral. But the problem we've now got, of course, is that over the last 5 years, all the whistleblowing's dried up. You know?
David, if I might just come in there and say, it's quite remarkable that we seem to have more and more former serving senior officers in the military who simply do not have the guts to come on the public stage and start talking about what's really going on. I am astonished at how cowardly these people are. They know some of it's going on, they're worried about it, but they're very worried about their reputations at the golf club, and they can't stand up. The other point that you've raised is that we are now seeing all of this high-level military integration being conducted simply verbally. It's being done verbally. It's not being done through any proper committee process with notes so that the public can keep track of what's going on. And this was the very style back in the Franco-British Council meetings in the early days, where they even got the serving military officers present to wear lounge suits instead of their uniforms. I believe that was because it was treason, and if they had gone into those meetings, highly political meetings, wearing uniform, some of those people might have thought twice. But this is serious, that we've got main politics about the nuclear deterrent and the military being conducted simply verbally.
I just want to bring Boris Johnson in at this point, and then I've got a question for David briefly. So let's hear what Boris said when he arrived for this meeting.
Good morning, everybody. Good morning. We're going to be having a discussion this morning, as I'm sure you know, about the continued role of the EU in defence and security, and clearly this is something that the UK supports, in the sense that we're always going to be part of Europe's wider security architecture, provided, of course, that does not undermine NATO. NATO is the cornerstone of our Atlantic alliance.
Okay, so long as it doesn't undermine NATO, and this kind of is what I suppose Fallon was saying as well, minimize duplication of effort. What do you think, David, the structure is going to be in terms of the relationship with NATO? Eventually looking into the furthest distance, are we seeing NATO subsumed by EU, or are they going to operate on the global stage in parallel?
Well, they keep saying this phrase, and as long as it doesn't impeach NATO, whatever. But that's exactly what it's doing. That's precisely what it's doing. You can't redirect all the policy and money flows into a completely new operating system without impeaching the existing. So, as I've said, NATO is just a bus to EU military unification, EU military union. And at some stage it'll stop and drop off, because if the money flows are directed elsewhere, which is currently what's sort of coming out of Germany and the EU, they're talking about massive spending increases in this field. So that means that, where's the rest of the money coming from? It's very easy to see how this is going to work. And in terms of the management, well, it's very straightforward. Brussels will just call the shots, and they'll say exactly who gets what contracts and where regiments and brigades and whatnot and ships under EU NAVFOR, EU Navy, where they go and what they do, and so on and so forth. So what we've got to come back to one sort of stumbling block here, and this is one thing that's been very, very difficult all the way through this campaign, is that when you've had the likes of Nigel Farage run off from me at the opening of Grassroots Out at Kettering during the start of Brexit campaign, he had no intention to stand and talk to me about EU military union, EU army, or whatever he wanted to call it. There was no engagement. His communications manager refused to then take meetings. So did the other communication managers at Vote Leave. This is what we've had all along, because the management of this will be through EU, and this nonsense where all our politicians are saying, "Oh, we've got to hang on to NATO." Well, hang on a minute. The security of this nation rests upon the people and the assets that we have in our armed services at the point at which we engage in anything. So whether that be under NATO or whatever, that responsibility rests with them, and whatever our capability is at the time in terms of our manufacturing in this country to sustain any kind of battle. So this is a nonsense to say that we can absolve, oh, well, it's all right, NATO will do it or whatever, because this whole thing rests upon those people, and we've cut them to smithereens, and we've demoralized them. The chaos isn't accidental. The chaos is deliberate. So, this language that Fallon and Boris is using there, just take it, turn it upside down, and it then makes perfect sense.
Yeah, indeed. Well, let's see, because we mentioned Chatham House at the beginning of this section. Foreign Affairs magazine carrying an article here from Jonathan Isle, the RUSI international director. So this is RUSI commenting the real problems with NATO. So they're covering some of this and saying that we've got to strengthen NATO's forward posture in Eastern Europe through the deployment of 4 additional battalions, 1 in each of the 3 Baltic states and 1 in Poland, plus additional assets in Romania. But of course, as we mentioned last week, the Romanians already coming under the control of the German CNC command and control because of their latest deals, their latest sort of Franco-British style integration arrangements. But the New York Times perhaps giving us a clue as to what's really going on. Fearing US withdrawal, Europe considers its own nuclear deterrent. And this is a headline in the New York Times today, echoing exactly what we've been talking about for weeks, David, since it was Brian's article on this issue of the nuclear deterrent. Is that right?
Oh, well, we've both covered it, yeah. Both David and myself. But this is absolutely key, because, of course, if you talk Europe's nuclear deterrent, you are simply talking France or UK. We've exposed the fact that Britain's nuclear deterrent has already been locked into the French nuclear deterrent. But who ultimately wants the nuclear weapons? That's Germany. And the interesting thing is that if you said, where is the biggest counter to the Germans having nuclear weapons, I don't even believe it would be the outcry from other European nations. I think it would be from within Germany, because the German public have said repeatedly they do not want nuclear weapons. So the Germans, or the German government, this is Angela Merkel, of course, is trying to take control ultimately of Britain's nuclear deterrent by the fact that it's being passed through the hands of a very deceitful French operation. So, David, I don't know whether you'd like to just add to that briefly.
Just briefly, yeah.
Yeah, well, absolutely. The nukes are the icing on the cake, and their cake is they have to. There's no uncertainty with any of this. Everybody's got to stop that. There's no uncertainty. The concept is very, 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 very specific. And under the quote from Avril Harriman, the whole concept was about having currency unification, military unification, so military union. That would then trigger a treasury, and that would then trigger full political union as a tyranny. It's unelected. So we're going to militarize a tyranny. Now, I can only think of the last times that we've had this model in Europe, and that was under the Romans, where there was a tyrannical, unelected arrangement where they had a joint treasury, and that was under Mark Antony and Augustus, post Julius Caesar. So I'm going to quote Cicero here, because this is the key. This is the key to all of this, is the euro itself. is that Cicero said that the sinews of war were infinite money. And that is exactly what we have under the ECB. And that's it, full stop. So we're now at, quite a crisis juncture in Europe with this, because we're going to militarize a tyranny with this. And if anybody doesn't realize just how important that is, if you think it was bad under World War I and World War II, what we're going to have under this operating system.
David, thank you very much for that summing up. I know that's made an impression on a few people in the chat box, and I hope that message gets through to a much wider public. Let's end on this note. I put some words in front of Fred Mogherini, as I've called her. I'm the High President of the Union for Foreign Affairs and Security Policy, Vice President of the Commission of the EU, an EU which has never produced any audited and signed accounts, but which is to spend another 2 billion euros of our money on security to protect their corruption. You could not make this up. I put that image out with a tweet. It seems to be going extremely well, but what a dangerous, dangerous organisation the EU is, and what dangerous politicians we've got. Mr. Fallon, Theresa May lying through their teeth as they lock us into the EU via military integration. We'll end there. If anybody wants to comment or contact me at all on what I've reported about the Mr. Howeson saga, please do. But remember, there is a court case in progress, and of course we mustn't interfere with that. Thanks for joining us today. We'll be back same time tomorrow. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.